Hi, welcome back to Homeschool Wherever. My name is Carmen Sognonvi, and in today's video, I am going to explain to you why we decided to homeschool our kids. So if you're new to our channel, we are a secular, multiracial family who lives in New York City, and we are embarking on homeschooling for the very first time this fall. And this channel is all about documenting that journey. We're also full-time family travel creators, so if you want to see that side of our life, check out our travel channel at Top Flight Family. So as you can probably guess, the first reason we decided to transition to homeschooling is because of travel. So we've been travel creators for about 5-6 years now, and in the early years, it was pretty easy to kind of schedule our trips around the girls' school schedules. So we would try to focus on long weekends, holidays, breaks, obviously doing a lot during the summer. And for a while that was actually working fine because New York City public schools are actually fairly lenient when it comes to time off compared to at least other states that I've heard of. So I think the sort of official or unofficial number of days you can take off before getting into kind of trouble with the DOE is about, I think, 18 to 19 days per academic year. So in the first few years, we always managed to stay under that. Now, as the years went on, we would bump up closer and closer against that limit, but we would always kind of manage to stay under that maximum. Now, this past school year, it got really dicey. When we were only a few months into the year, I could already tell that we were gonna go way over that year. So I actually had a meeting with the vice principal and kind of explained our situation, and he was actually really, really cool about it. And he was very supportive of what we did. He was actually really excited to learn what we did. And he really also understands, the educational value of travel itself for kids. So he was very willing to work with us. The girls' teachers were also willing to work with us. So it's not necessarily that we got a ton of pushback from the school itself, but it kind of got to a point where I didn't feel great about having my kids taking off that much time from school. My mom was a teacher, so I have a lot of respect for the profession. And, I'm Asian, so of course, I also respect authority and boundaries. And to me, it kind of felt like it was getting to a point where we were almost being a little disrespectful to the school, if that makes sense. And again, this was nothing that the school said to us. It was just my feeling of, things not really feeling that great. And also on a lot of trips, Sean, our oldest, started to get really stressed out because she was much more aware of the work that she was missing. Our youngest really didn't mind. She would be able to catch up on homework really quickly when she got back. But for our oldest, who was in 5th grade this past year, the workload started getting pretty significant. And so she would come back from a trip and have like a stack of papers that she needed to catch up on. So she wasn't really feeling that great either about it. So after trying to figure out how we could better balance the two, school and travel, I finally decided, I think we got to do this homeschool thing. And trust me, I was like the last person that I would ever expect to go down that path. I actually know a lot of parents who homeschool, and in my mind, I was like, God, bless your heart, I could never. It was like that typical reaction. But then the more I started thinking about it, the more I was like, this feels really right, because not only is it going to allow us to travel more and have a more flexible schedule, but there's all these other benefits to it as well. So I'm gonna get into some of those reasons next. Now, the second reason that we decided to homeschool is because I really want my girls to learn history in a way that's not so Eurocentric and that's a little bit sort of more decolonized. Now, as a kid, I actually lived in quite a few different countries and I got to experience quite a few different educational systems. And one thing that I noticed, even as a young kid, is that countries are very good about talking about the injustices that other countries have perpetrated, but they're not very good about talking about the injustices in their own history. So when I went to British schools when I lived in Hong Kong, my teachers were very open in talking about some of the atrocities that the Spanish conquistadores had inflicted throughout Latin America. So they were very open in talking about how the Spaniards had colonized those countries, the terrible ways in which they had treated the indigenous people there. However, when it came to sort of self-examination, there was a little bit less of that. So for example, when I studied history in my GCSEs, which in the British system is 9th and 10th grade, we literally dedicated an entire 2 years to studying Gladstone and Disraeli, and like every single bill and act that they had ever passed, in lots and lots of boring detail. And somehow when it came to studying the Opium War, my school just really glossed over it and moved on very quickly. And that really blew my mind, especially considering the fact that we were living in Hong Kong. And literally the reason why that British teacher was standing in that British school is because of the Opium War, because Hong Kong was lost as a territory to Britain as a result of that war. So I share that story to say that this is not unique to the United States. I mean, every country is going to be a little bit more hesitant to examine their own problematic history. So as I mentioned, Sean and Ella have been in public school since kindergarten, and unlike a lot of homeschooling families, we actually didn't have a particularly negative experience with public school. We were lucky to get them into a school that was pretty diverse, pretty progressive, really good academically, but of course it wasn't perfect. And one of the things that always stuck out to me was how the school taught and handled some of the problematic aspects of US history, things like slavery, things like genocide of Native Americans, things like the civil rights struggles. So there were so many instances where girls would come home and be like, oh, we learned about Rosa Parks today, and she was super tired, so she didn't want to give up her seat on the bus and blah, blah, blah. Like, still like recycling that tired narrative of like, she was just some old lady who was like super tired. And, like in those situations, we kind of had to like reteach the lesson and give them more of the real story of, well, actually, she was a very dedicated civil rights activist and she had a long history of activism. This was a planned boycott. She was not just some lady who was too tired to get up. So there's been so many moments like that. And one of the things that I'm really excited about when it comes to homeschooling is being able to take a different approach to American history. Instead of centering the narrative always on the English or the European settlers, the way that it is usually taught in most schools. Another thing I noticed about public school and the way that they handle these topics is that they do all of these like grammatical gymnastics in order to construct sentences to explain things that don't blame anyone for perpetrating them. So for example, conflicts between the European settlers and Native Americans, it was always sort of framed as it wasn't always easy to get along. And like, I get that there is such a thing as teaching topics in an age-appropriate way. However, I think that when you have to kind of twist yourself into a pretzel to avoid saying, hey, these people are responsible, they enacted these policies which greatly hurt this other group of people. Like, if you need to really twist things around that much, then I think there's a problem. So the third reason we decided to homeschool is to be able to educate our kids in an environment where they are not labeled as much. So again, overall, our experience with public school was fairly positive. I am not one of those parents that just only has terrible things to say about the public school system. We lucked out in a lot of ways. However, I will say that one of the things that also has always bothered me is I always felt like my girls were put into a specific box very, very early on. From kindergarten onward or from first grade onward. And once they were put in that box by one teacher, then all their subsequent teachers were kind of told like, hey, Sean or Ella, they're this type of student. And I'm sure there's a very common feeling, right? I'm not the first parent to experience this. It's one of those tricky things because I'm like, am I just being biased because obviously I love my child and I think they're awesome? And so I'm not able to give sort of a rational assessment of their skills. But then often all this other evidence would come up where I'm like, no, I'm not crazy. Like, they're definitely being labeled in a way which actually isn't necessarily accurate to what their actual skill level is or what their actual aptitude is. So just as an example, both of our girls were always put into programs where they would get additional help with reading. And during parent-teacher conferences, I always felt like there was this big gap between the way the teachers sort of described what my girls were like in their classroom versus what I observed at home. And I don't necessarily blame the teachers for this. I don't think that this is purely some kind of thing where it's like, oh, these evil teachers are being racist and, like they're only looking at the black girls a certain way. Like it's, of course, there's going to be some of that mixed up in this, but I don't think it's that. I think it's a very complex mix of things where, yes, there are already some expectations and preconceptions on the teacher's end. But then also, I think there's also this complex thing where our kids in a big classroom like that don't necessarily sort of conduct themselves the way that they do at home. And I don't mean behavior-wise. I mean, like, very often I kind of got the feeling that my girls were sort of like deliberately dimming their light a little bit, if that makes sense. Sort of like their actual aptitude level was here, but what they would show in the classroom was like here. And that was always the sense that I got. And it was one of those things that's kind of hard to prove, hard to sort of argue about. And again, because I do have a lot of respect for teachers, I never really wanted to kind of be that parent that's like, oh no, you're crazy. Like, my kid's a genius, da 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 da. Like, I didn't want to be that parent. But at the same time, obviously, you want to advocate for your kids. So I realized that was a lot of rambling. I don't know if any of that made sense, but I think the bottom line is that I feel like when we are going to be homeschooling, there's going to be less of that labeling being put on my children, and there's going to be more of a sense that they can just be themselves and be relaxed and not have to sort of adhere to some idea that someone else has of them, or feel like they have to dim their light because they don't want to show off, or, you know, I just feel like they're going to be able to be themselves a little bit more. So the fourth reason we decided to homeschool relates back to travel again. And that is, I'm really excited about the ability to kind of customize the things that we are studying so that we can actually better tie them in to the trips that we're doing. Or conversely, to choose trips that will also support things that we are studying in our homeschool. So just one perfect example of this is this summer we did a trip to Williamsburg in Virginia, and we went to Jamestown, we went to Yorktown, we walked around Colonial Williamsburg. So during this time, we weren't doing any schooling at all. You know, we were going through the deschooling process. So in other words, we didn't do anything academic. I didn't make them read even. So I really just let them do whatever they wanted all summer so that we could come to homeschool in September with a completely blank slate. So for that reason, we didn't go super in depth. But what we did do in preparation of that trip is to watch a couple videos that tells the real story of Pocahontas. Obviously, Sean and Ella have seen the Disney film. They love the Disney film. However, the Disney film is extremely historically inaccurate because it's all based on John Smith's own writings. And, you know, now we know that John Smith basically just made a lot of stuff up. And so we watched a few videos together that kind of broke down what was the real story of Pocahontas and what really happened to her. And so when we went to Jamestown and we were walking around the recreated Powhatan village and talking to the historical interpreters, it just made it such a richer experience because we were coming to it with that knowledge of, wow, you know, this is the exact area where Pocahontas actually lived and played. And it just really made us appreciate that so much more. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, I'm going to link our vlog from the Williamsburg trip below in case you want to check that out. So that's just one small example of something that we've done already before we even started homeschooling, but I'm just really looking forward to finding more ways to tie what we're studying into our travels and really making those two just like an integral part of our lifestyle and very, very much just interlinked with each other. Now, the fifth reason that we decided to homeschool is to have a much more flexible schedule. Now, of course, part of this ties back to travel again. You know, we're going to have more flexibility to travel more or to be able to travel on days that, you know, normally we wouldn't be able to do if the kids were still in public school. But it goes really beyond that. So our house is pretty far from where the girls go to school. And so every morning we would be up at 6 a.m. By 7 a.m. we've left the house. I drive them, drop them all the way back at school, drive all the way back, drive to my office, do work on my blog there. And then when it's time for school pickups, I drive all the way back to pick them up. So there were so many days where I would leave the house at 7 a.m. and we wouldn't even get home till like 9, 10 p.m. because of all the other activities that they had going on after school and things like that. And so it was just really, really, really hectic. And on top of all that, obviously, we're also taking tons of time off to travel. So it's like we're squeezing in the travel amidst this already very busy schedule. And it was just exhausting. You know, every day I was spending 3 to 4 hours a day driving back and forth and back and forth. And I just wasn't being the best mom that I could be. You know, I was always tired, I was always cranky, and we just didn't have time to do anything fun. You know, it was like school and activities, all of that took up so much time that it was like basically during the week we were just sort of like just surviving, and then on the weekends we would just kind of crash and just be exhausted and not necessarily spend quality time together until we traveled. And that's one of the reasons why we cherish the travel so much, is because that was really our special quality time as a family. And so that's how our lives have been like for the last few years, and it's been really exhausting. So one of the things I'm really excited about with homeschooling is having a much more relaxed pace, you know, waking up at a more reasonable hour, having time to kind of enjoy breakfast and enjoy a chat over breakfast, not just kind of like rush so that we can get out the door, and just in general, just feel more relaxed and be able to enjoy each other more. Okay, so if you would like to learn more about our family, check out that video below. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. And be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok as well at Homeschool Wherever. Thanks for watching.